My name is Ken Packie. I'm a former telecom tech and a full-time wood sculptor now. And we've got a lot of views on YouTube with Sawdust. And I wanted to answer some of the questions that have come about, starting with the physical aspect of what I do. When I started doing this, I was an outdoor guy, mountain biking and whitewater and snowboarding, and I thought I was in pretty good shape. It kicked my butt. That first year of carving full-time, it took a while for everything to tighten up and get used to basically the repetition of doing thousands of lifts with the various chainsaws that I use. So after that happened, it just became fun. It was fun anyway. But when I started doing this, the time essence, how much do I work? I didn't want to start doing this, take weekends off, fail, and look back and say, should have worked on weekends. So I looked at this as a 7-day-a-week job. So if you're going to be a full-time carver, you've got to look at it as a 7-day-a-week job. So the equipment necessary when I decided to do this full-time, I can get by. I've been accused of being a Neanderthal because I keep it pretty simple with what I do. My buddies tell me I'm rubbing sticks together. But I can show up at a competition with small, medium, large, and these power tools and do everything I need to do. So the chainsaws initially, it's good to have at least 2, possibly 3, and it's always good to have a bigger one when you start doing big pieces of wood. And the weight of these things are going to vary from 10 pounds to 12 pounds to 13 pounds. And that can tax on you when you start carving physically because you're constantly moving up and down and going around your piece, and your body has to get used to that movement. And all those muscles that you don't really use in ways you don't use them, eventually they do tighten up. It's also important to have your safety gear. First thing on, last thing off are my chaps. In this case, I'm wearing chainsaw pants, ear protection, and eye protection. So those things are completely necessary when you're doing this. Now, I do my block out with the saws, and you can get very tight with the chainsaw as far as your detail is concerned. I run Husqvarna XP saws now. Power to weight is awesome, the reliability is awesome, and the carving bars I use are a Canadian company called Canon, and I keep it pretty uniform with my sizes. The last one I'm going to use is this dime tip. The middle saw, probably most of the meat and potatoes are either a 1/4 tip or a toonie tip, about 16 inches long, and I'll start my block out with one of these 2 saws with the 20 or 24-inch toonie tip. And then after I'm done with this saw, I'll break out the tool for my eyes as a die grinder, like a big Dremel, and I just have this shaped eye tool that I'll use to go ahead and set the eyes. I also have an angle grinder with a sanding disc, my drill with either a flap sander, and then a couple of brushes that I'll use. And this is another flap sander. And then I'll also just use a Dremel tool very minimally. I'll usually use this for the eyes to kind of set the pupil after I do the burn. So I do have chisels I'll use sometimes, but I keep it pretty simple. I'll use that sweep and these couple of knives, and I can get most of my detail into my pieces with pretty much what you see right here. The other integral part, of course, is the fire. I always say I use chainsaw, chisels, and fire. What happens is after I do my carve and I do my sanding and my finish work, I'll burn the piece, and that'll clean up a lot of the furring that you get from the chainsaw. So that's the equipment necessary. Your initial buy-in only really has to be a couple of saws and probably the die grinder and the angle grinder, and you can do a lot with a little. Now you need raw materials, and that always depends where you are. You find what works where you are, what has the best attributes. On the East Coast, white pine is a wonderful wood for a couple of reasons. It's big, very neutral color, so when I do that burn, I can do all my patterns into this. And it's also cheap to free. There's not a big market for it. So I recycle everything I use, whether it's from a homeowner, whether it's from a logging company, whether it's from a tree service. I can usually get them to deliver it with their equipment, and then my carving spot happens to be a saw shop, and they have a loader. I also have a tractor, so the moving around of the pieces usually involves my tractor and my equipment trailer. So the big piece that I carved in Sawdust, the big black bear, I just strapped that right to the bucket, drove up onto my trailer, repeated the process at the customer's house. So that's really pretty much the easy part. The hard part's actually creating the art. Delivery can be stressful, but boys like their toys up here in the Berkshire Hills, and so it's always easy to find somebody with a piece of equipment. So after your carving is done, it comes down to finish work, and I have some samples of a few different levels of finish that I do that we can go take a look at. So I do all different levels of finish, and it depends on customers' requirements. If it's a piece I'm doing for myself, what I want to see. It also depends on the type of wood. I have a few pieces I did out in California out of old growth redwood, and that has such natural, rich colors. I tend not to do any burning, or of course don't add any paint to it. I just leave it natural the way it is. When I'm working on the East Coast, if I'm working in the Midwest, out of poplar, out of white pine, out of catalpa, I tend to use the torch to burn the whole piece, which will clean up that furring. And then I'll use the wire brushes on my drill to knock back a lot of the burn I do to create those patterns. And everything gets sealed off with a oil mixture that I do. Now, sometimes on the East Coast, what I'll do is, besides doing the burn, like you see here, I will add washes of color as an accent, sometimes just down on the leaves to make it pop, or on the piece where I do a wash of color on that barn owl, a little wash of gray, a wash of green. When I do add color, I like to sand some of that back though to antique it, because when I put the oils on at the end, it richens everything up. Now, exceptions where the whole thing has to be painted tend to be black bears. People on the East Coast like their bears black. So I'll put the oil into this piece, and then I'll put a top coat of a UV protected outdoor oil paint, which is a nice robust finish. And what I tend to use as my oils now is I mix my own. I'll use either spar varnish and spar urethane, and I'll mix that with linseed oil and either paint thinner or mineral spirits, about a third, a third, a third. It ups the oil content and kind of turns it into a penetrating oil. And the more oil that wood absorbs, the more it's going to kind of slow down the drying process and minimize your cracking. Now, a big log is going to crack. You really can't avoid it. There's certain workarounds, especially if it's going into a dry environment, where you could put a relief cut in the piece, which kind of forces it to open in one spot. You can carve the piece and let it sit for a year, and then it's going to dry and crack, and you can do your repairs, and then you can oil it, and it's a more stable medium. A big part of these pieces that the chainsaw carvers make is letting the customer understand it's wood, it's going to move. It was alive once, it's kind of alive still. With the weather, it opens, closes, it swells shut, and it's part of the romance of the medium. So you have to understand that wood's going to do that. It's a wonderful medium to work with, and down the road, as long as the piece is oiled and maintained, if any cracks develop, they're usually easily fixed, and it's a one-time fix after the piece is dry. I'd like to thank everybody for watching. Keep all your questions coming, and we'll talk to everybody soon.